The Expression of Wisdom by Mehmet Karahisari. Lesson 2. The Expression of Wisdom. At the outset of our book The Gnosis of Wisdom, Hikmatin Marifati, we expounded the meaning by which wisdom and gnosis are not identical, by way of the question of the Sufi and the Malami within the history of Tasawwuf. Wisdom is the fruit of an initiation and is subject to its own particular method. Accordingly, wisdom has been expressed by means of methods proper to itself. To read this manner of expression, that is to say, the writing what is required, is wisdom literacy. In this connection, the works of Ibn Arabi are, beyond being mere texts, a living ground of dialogue from which the author addresses the reader through the very interstices of the lines. Ibn Arabi speaks first with the rationalists and the philosophers, and then with the theologians. Yet when the matter turns to the expression of gnosis, he begins his discourse with Bāyazīd al-Bisṭāmī weaving the meaning, stitch by stitch, by means of the latter's symbolic indications and allusions. The works of Ibn Arabi have been composed in this polyphonic and reality-centered mode of writing. Ibn Arabi did not compose his books in a systematic fashion from beginning to end, but rather wrote his discourses in general as independent units. On occasion he called even a 4-page work a book. In this sense, every chapter of the al-Futuhat al-Makkiyah is to be considered a book in its own right. It is for this reason that certain questions and edifying narratives are frequently repeated. This sense corresponds to a reality which René Guénon recalls to us. In the ancient tradition, works in which gnosis is expressed are written without any effort or endeavor toward systematization. When today, by reading from within modernity, we seek to understand Ibn Arabi, we struggle to comprehend the repetitions in his works, or the appearance in another chapter of a meaning that had been left unfinished. We expect to read engineered texts, constructed according to compositional techniques and rules. The academic intellect of our time, which works on Ibn Arabi, and especially the theologians, find his works defective in this regard. Yet all ancient works are of this character. Specialists in Sufism, for their part, level their criticisms upon his rhetoric and syntax. They have particular difficulty in understanding the poems of Ibn Arabi and do not find them aesthetically accomplished. They expect that the meaning be expressed within a modern systematic order. We call this the degree of discursive thought, or engineering. In the ancient tradition, no such method of writing exists. When we look upon the entirety of the ancient tradition that has continued without interruption prior to modernity, we see that the sacred texts too are of this form. In every surah, certain meanings are repeated. This method of writing is therefore the correlate and reflection, within books composed by the knowledge that comes from the Quran al-Hakim, of the meaning that is contained within the Quran al-Hakim and the sacred books. In our book In the Footsteps of the Greatest Sheikh, we spoke of not reading Ibn Arabi but reading within Ibn Arabi. This meaning passes through wayfaring at his door. Only on this condition does he open the gates of wisdom. The first stage in the reading of the texts of Ibn Arabi is to attend to the author's own explanations concerning his own writing. Ibn Arabi has expressed the proper methods for reading his texts both within the texts themselves and in independent treatises. As an author, he has works such as Kitab al-Mazal, in which he sets forth his own concerns and his own questions as a separate work. We likewise observe that he placed at the conclusion of al-Futuhat al-Makkiyah a summary forming an entire volume. This summary is not to be considered as a table of contents to the work. Rather, it is the section in which the author expounds the secrets within all of the chapters and translates them into discursive expression. Alongside the secrets, the discourses and the questions operative in the background are also taken up in this section. Ibn Arabi, in his concern to expound them, has given place to these questions repeatedly throughout all of his works. What then is his question precisely? In Kitab al-Mazal, the addressees are the theologians. Accordingly, the language and technical vocabulary of the book is oriented toward theologians. The 53 questions taken up in this book have, at their core, 3 principles. The first of these is the principle: the intellect has a limit. Ibn Arabi's foremost concern is to expound the intellect and its limits. Behind the dialogue with the rationalists to which he gives place in all his books, there lies this meaning concerning gnosis. The second principle is, divinity may be apprehended by the intellect, but it cannot be unveiled. The third is, the essence may be unveiled, but it cannot be apprehended by the intellect. Ibn Arabi sets forth, here, the limits of gnosis. The intellect is limited, it can apprehend divinity, but divinity cannot be unveiled. The essence, on the other hand, can be unveiled, but it cannot be apprehended by intellect. The matter of the limit of the intellect is the foremost focus of the questions of the Ibn Arabi. What follows thereafter concerns the question of what gnosis is. For Ibn Arabi, gnosis is a divine knowledge. Whether one calls it gnosis or wisdom, the meaning is the same. The greatest master employs, in Kitab al-Mazal, a striking expression: nafs is an ocean without a shore. Unveiling discloses that our knowing of ourselves is a sea from which there is no shore to be reached. Created beings are inadequate to the apprehension of their own souls. The very same statement he repeats with respect to the Quran al-Hakim: the Quran is an ocean without a shore. The whole cosmos, which is termed the Great Book, is the Quran. The reading of this mode of writing called the cosmos is by means of the act of Iqra, recite, the first command of the Quranic revelation. The reading of the writing within the leaves that have been sent down and reduced to sacred texts is termed tilawa. In this sense, there is the question of the human being who is an ismus reading both the Quran, the Furqan, and his own self as a mode of writing. When this reading is accomplished, the meaning is brought forth. The connection between the human being and the Quran cannot be sundered. The two are two faces of a single meaning and are not independent of one another. Traditional books are subject-centered. The subject, in the first-person singular, speaks of himself within the text. He writes his own narrative and gives voice to it. The text is a text of speech. We call this an oral cultural work. The works of Ibn Arabi are works of oral tradition. Within these works he speaks with 3 different addresses and employs 3 different languages. When speaking with a philosopher, he employs the technical vocabulary of philosophy on questions pertaining to the rationalists. When speaking with a theologian, he employs the technical vocabulary of kalam. When speaking with Bāyazīd al-Bisṭāmī, he expounds the essential question. Particularly in al-Futuhat al-Makkiyah, when speaking of gnosis and wisdom, before him stands Bāyazīd al-Bisṭāmī alone. Accordingly, what Ibn Arabi says when speaking with Bāyazīd al-Bisṭāmī is what we must look upon, for gnosis lies precisely there. Ibn Arabi declares, Tasawwuf began with Bāyazīd al-Bisṭāmī. Accordingly, in his discourses concerning Bāyazīd al-Bisṭāmī, he speaks of gnosis. It is that portion which is the most demanding. The other portions concern cosmological and philosophical matters. Yet our essential concern is to apprehend his gnosis. When reading the few alaikum likewise, we must look to whom he refers, and to which of his books he points when expounding his questions. Our master the Pir Ibn Arabi at appropriate occasions impels the reader toward further reading by saying, I have written upon this matter in such and such of my books. Certain questions he repeats again and again, and everything that is repeated has to do with Bāyazīd al-Bisṭāmī.